Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott. Over the last several weeks, I've had to bite my tongue because some of you have asked the question that I've often heard, and that is, when is there going to be a less expensive alternative to the very expensive Sony 100-400mm G Master lens for Sony mirrorless? Well, the answer is today, right now, because the Sigma 100-400mm F5-6.3 DG DN-OS lens has been announced for Sony and Leica, and I've been playing with one for the last several weeks, putting it through the paces, and I'm here today to give you my definitive review of this very exciting new lens. Now, of course, the 100-400mm focal length remains a very popular one for the simple reason that it's about the last bit of focal range like this that can get you out to 400 millimeters that can still be done competently in a compact package. As a byproduct, you know, it's basically the size of a 70-200 millimeter f2.8 zoom, and so it's manageable for most photographers. It fits more easily into most camera bags and carrying systems, but still gives you a fair amount of reach and can be useful for wildlife, birding, sports, etc. And so, of course, while the 100-400 millimeter GM lens has certainly been on a lot of photographers' wish list, its price tag of nearly $2,500 has put it outside of the reach of many photographers. So I'm sure you would be delighted to understand that this Sigma will come and it will cost you less than $1,000 and will give you a lot of the performance and image quality of the GM lens. How much so? Well, that's what we're here to determine. So if you prefer your reviews to be shorter and more to the point, then I recommend that you watch the standard review, and you can access that at this link here. Today, however, we're going to jump in detail, draw some comparisons, show you some photos, do a lot of that work, and help you to draw a conclusion as to whether or not the new Sigma is for you. We're going to start by going hands-on and giving you a close look at this lens, its features, its handling, its build. Let's jump in, let's take a look. So we'll look a little bit closer here. First of all, you can see there is a mix of materials that makes this actually a nicer built lens than your standard contemporary lens, which is, again, kind of a meaningless designation, but they tend to be a little less well made than either the art or the sport series. In this case, I'm not sure that that is true. The original frame here is made out of a magnesium alloy, and so very, very tough, obviously, same material that cameras are built out of. Here you also have a brass mount, and so a really secure mount, which is kind of a Sigma trait. I will also note that there is a nice thick gasket here, which is actually surprisingly thick for a Sony lens, and so a little more robust there. At the same time, I don't see language from Sigma designating other seal points inside, and so maybe they're there, maybe they're not. I suspect if they were, they would mention that. So most of the moisture resistance and dust resistance is concentrated at the lens mount. Now, I will note that there is enough width here and depth for use with teleconverters, and in fact for Leica there are both a 1.4 times and 2 times teleconverter being announced alongside this lens. Nothing yet for Sony, and so hopefully we'll see a Sigma release something like that in the future. I do suspect, while I don't have one on hand, that there is probably room for a Sony TC to fit in there, but we'll find out after I've been able to test, and I will pin a comment down below letting you know whether or not that works after my contact at Sony gives a little test. Now, moving on from here, first of all, I want to note the way that the lens ships without the tripod collar. And so what you've got here is actually a rubber sleeve that fits over, covering the screw heads. It says 100-400 on here. So part of the reason why this whole section is reimbursed in a higher grade material is that it is designed, fortunately, for use with a tripod foot. And in fact, in this case, it is the same tripod collar that ships with the Sigma 105mm f1.4 Art Series lens. And so you have got a fairly standard, effective tripod collar here, does all the typical stuff. You can rotate and lock at any point. There are some, markings at cardinal points to allow you to line that up. tripod foot is Arca Swiss compatible, which I really love when that is the case. Nicely made. It'll give you about 123 extra grams of weight on the lens if you elect to use it. Now, one advantage versus either the Sony, or in this case I've got the Canon that's standing in as a substitute since that's what I own, is that their tripod foot is removable, the collar is fixed and permanent. So it does mean that you have the option here of, having a little bit less weight if you tend to use it handheld, and of course you can elect whether or not you want the additional expense for that tripod collar itself. If you don't, of course, you're free to use the lens handheld and to just utilize this rubberized sleeve that they've given you to cover up those screw heads. And if you seat it there properly, it looks pretty seamless, looks like it belongs there. Now, the rest of the material is a mix of some metals and, nice, great engineered plastics. I don't really have any complaints about the build. It's not as robust as what the GM lens is, but neither is this a cheaply made lens. The focus ring is the next thing that you come to. It's actually nicely damped and very quality feeling, nicely executed. There is a bank of switches here. And so for the most part, we've got everything we've got on the GM AF MF switch. We've got a 3-position focus limiter. We have got a focus hold button, and we have got a 2-position OS standard mode, and then 2 for panning, or you can turn it off. And of course, great to have an optical stabilizer here in the lens itself. And it's rated at about 4 stops. So not at the top of the class, but certainly a useful amount of additional assistance. One area where we do distinguish that while it has the focus hold button, the GM has that at 3 of the cardinal positions to make it more accessible, but at least it is here. You also have a focus lock. The Sony lens actually utilizes, like the Canon, utilizes the tension ring to where you either loosen or tighten rather than a focus lock. Advantage of the tension ring is that you can implement that at any kind of zoom position. So if I wanted it at 300 millimeters, I'm now locked around 300 millimeters. The Sigma will only lock at the 100 millimeter position, and it will not lock at any other position. However, one other nice feature that we do have here is that this lens is purposely designed around having the option of being both a twist zoom, the zoom action, although there's a lot of barrel extension, it moves nice and smoothly, no wobble or play there. But you'll see that there is a texturized portion here on the lens hood. It is designed so you can also use the lens as a push-pull design. And so a lot of people that have used 100 to 400 millimeters, they actually prefer a push-pull design, and were disappointed when the Canon, for example, and the Mark I, it was a push-pull design, and they moved to a traditional, kind of twist zoom action. Not really designed the same way around the push-pull. This is purposely designed with that in mind. And so anyway, a nice feature there. The GM lens has a window here for accessing a circular polarizer. Sigma doesn't have that, but you'll notice there is a nice flare here and also a relatively small 6-7 millimeter front filter size. As a result, there's a lot of room to reach in there and rotate a polarizer should you happen to use one. And so again, I don't think that that is a major loss there. Overall, just to give you an idea of dimensions, this lens weighs in at 1,135 grams, that's 40 ounces, and so that compares to the GM that weighs in at about 1,400 grams. It's also a little bit shorter than the GM lens by about 8 millimeters, 197 millimeters versus 205 millimeters, and it is also slimmer in diameter. The Canon lens is identical to the Sony, and so you can see that the Sigma lens is quite a bit slimmer, which gives it obviously a sleeker look when it is mounted on the camera. And some of you, I know, really prefer having a black lens just because it is less, attracts less attention outside. So anyway, it looks good mounted on the camera. As far as the weight, it is going to be a little bit of front heavy. It's better to support a lens like this with the other hand. And if you're going to be carrying it in, a harness situation, I would recommend buying the tripod collar and putting your connection point there, just so you are putting less stress on your lens mount on a regular basis. Overall, I like the build and handling that we've got here. It is a fairly feature-rich lens for a bargain lens that costs less than half as much as the GM, so you're really not giving up a whole lot if you choose to go with the Sigma. So by and large, a lot of good going on here. As I noted, the contemporary brand continues to be a somewhat pointless designation to me. All new lenses in one sense are contemporary, and before long even those that are new now will no longer be contemporary in that sense. And if it's about design language, there's nothing any more contemporary about the design than either the art or the sport, because frankly they all look pretty similar. So all of that aside, this is a nicely built lens, not at the level of the GM, but a mix of some good materials there. It seems quality, durable. I don't think that you'll have any problems with it on that front. It's also fairly feature rich, giving up quite little in terms of feature to the GM lens. Now, as noted, the tripod collar is a separate accessory that will set you back a little over around 120 extra bucks US, and whatever it is in your local market. And so you can determine whether or not you want or need one for your applications. Now, this lens has a stepping motor focus system. My chief criticism when I reviewed in 2017, I reviewed the 100-400mm contemporary for Canon and Nikon DSLR. My greatest criticism at that point was, number one, on the physical side, it wasn't really designed with a tripod collar in mind, even in its physical design. There were some that could be tacked on later, but it was never a magnificent fix. And so in this case, they've improved on that by designing this lens purposely with a tripod collar in mind. My biggest criticism, however, was while the optics in the lens were very good, I was far less impressed with its autofocus performance and just didn't find it fast enough to keep up with tracking a fast action, particularly when compared with, say, the Canon 100-400, a more premium lens. So how does this guy hold up? First of all, the stepping motor is an improvement when it comes to the sound and the smoothness and also the speed of focus. You really won't hear hardly any focus sound unless you put your ear right up next to the barrel. Most focus changes are near instantaneous. In AFC mode, I point it, half depress the shutter button, and it's focused. And so very, very fast, very smooth, very quiet. And as you can see, that bears out even for video focus pulls. Let's take a quick look at that. So, nothing to complain about there, obviously. What's most important, however, is how does it perform when it comes to keeping up with tracking action? I will note before that I saw the typical thing that, sometimes if you're trying to focus on a close object and there's busy background, sometimes it's a little hesitant to grab the foreground object. However, it obviously does help to use the focus limiter if your background is, more than 6 meters away. If not, you typically are you can either manually override, often touching on the screen and just kind of detecting a smaller box will help with that. But as far as tracking goes, I used my A9. If you go down to kind of optimum settings, just shooting JPEGs, I got right on 15 frames per second. Now, I know that in theory, my A9 should give me 20 frames per second. I've actually never seen that, by the way. Maybe your mileage may vary, but even with Sony branded lenses, I've been fortunate to get 17 or 18 frames per second. So 15 versus 17, not necessarily a huge difference. And what I was most impressed by is that I was still able to get 13 or 14 frames per second while shooting uncompressed RAWs and extra fine JPEGs. That's kind of more what matters to me. What I found is that in these tracking sequences, the focus overall had no problem keeping up. I will note that the actual environment was a little bit more challenging. They became very wet, and so byproduct is that a darker face and muzzle means that there's less contrast between the fur and the eyes too. But overall, as you can see, I was able to freeze lots of action. I don't think that the tracking is 100% there with the GM. I'm going to say it's more like 85 to 90%, But for most people, I think it's going to be sufficient for you to get a lot of wonderful results. Also here you can take a look at just a panning bird in flight shot. You can see that the autofocus system stayed on it and gave me successful results throughout it. So overall, I'm quite impressed with the results I got, particularly since I consider the fact that I believe the Sony lenses were advantaged in my test by shooting snowing conditions where there is light reflecting up, not being wet on the dog's faces, so there's more contrast between the fur and the eyes. And so I think the Sigma did fairly good in these situations, despite that disadvantage. And I would say that it probably has given us somewhere between 85 and 90% of the focus and tracking performance of the much more expensive GM lens. So what was a tremendous weakness for the predecessor of this lens has now become, if not a strength, at the very least, it is now, I believe, competitive with the much more expensive options. And that's no longer a reason why you should not consider the lens. And so that's a huge step in the right direction. So kudos to Sigma on that. So how about the image quality? Well, the good news is this always was a strength for the Sigma 100-400mm optical formula. Let's see how it holds up though on higher resolution bodies like the 42 megapixel A7R Mark III that I tested on. Let's jump in and let's take a look at those image quality results. So we'll start by looking at distortion and vignette at 100 millimeters. As you can see, there is a very mild amount of pincushion distortion, a little bit of vignette, nothing too significant. You can see here I've done a mild manual correction that's given us a clean end result of both vignette and distortion. Now throughout the zoom range, there's a steady increase in the amount of pincushion distortion that reaches a peak at 400 millimeters. It's not terribly destructive here, and it is nice and linear, so as you can see, cleans up well. Also, vignette has increased, and once again, it cleans up just fine manually. There isn't, of course, this lens is just being announced, so there is not yet any profiles for RAW files in software. However, you will have in-camera profile for JPEGs and video right out of the box. We've got excellent control of chromatic aberrations. I didn't really see any lateral CA and no longitudinal CA here. You can see no green or purple fringing really showing up. And we've got pretty nice contrast here on our line of focus. Out in the real world, in these high contrast areas with these white blossoms, I'm also not seeing any evidence of chromatic aberrations. Very, very well controlled, and as you can see, lots of great detail there, wide open on this lens. Here's another case in point, and it also shows up something we'll get to in a moment, that this lens actually has quite nice bokeh. But we can see once again, looking at it from a chromatic aberration perspective, we really don't have any issues with CA there at all. I will quickly note that the Sigma does not suffer from focus breathing in the way that the Canon lens does. And so here framed at 100 millimeters, you can see they were both at the exact same distance. The Sigma is filling the frame with the chart, and you can see that there is a considerably less than filling the frame with the Canon. So that's definitely a strength for Sigma there. So just for a quick look overall, just the Sigma itself, you can see at a 1-to-1 level, nice and crisp there in the center of the frame, good contrast. Mid-frame, everything looks really great here as well. Right off into the corner, a good performance there. And so taking independently, we have got a great performance. We'll compare it to the competitors though. So if we go into a 2-to-1 level here, and so really magnifying things, we can see that there is kind of some give and take in the center of the frame between the Sigma here and the GM. And so you can see GM maybe has a hair more contrast. It also, though, doesn't have maybe as much detail, and so it's a very close thing. Looking here at the mid frame, we can see that there is a little bit different lighting results, but there's not a dramatic difference. Maybe a slight bit more performance from the GM, but would be impossible to see without them side by side. Contrast levels are quite similar looking, and if we look down here in the corner, I do think the GM has got the edge with a very strong edge and corner performance. Now the real benchmark here is the Canon 100-400L Mark II, which is still, in my opinion, the best lens optically in the class. You can see center of the frame, it's definitely got a little bit of a contrast improvement and a little bit of resolution improvement. That remains true mid-frame, where you can just see a little bit finer detail, a little less kind of haze on textures from the Canon. And down in the corner, the Canon definitely looks a little bit better, but it's not by a whole lot of a margin either. Now, stopping the Sigma down to f8 doesn't produce a tremendous increase of resolution, a little bit more consistency in the contrast, but it's not making a major difference at 100 millimeters. Now, if we move on to 200 millimeters against the top flight Canon, we find that there's definitely an edge in the overall contrast for the Canon. Not a huge margin, but definitely noticeable. Mid-frame, just a little bit more contrast. Detail and resolution is more similar than different. We'll take a look at another spot, and I draw the same conclusion there. Down in the corner of the frame, we find that, again, it's mostly about contrast. I do think there's a bit more resolution for the Canon, but it's not by a wide margin. It does have better contrast wide open across the frame. With the GM lens, the difference is a little less obvious. These two are quite close here in the center of the frame with a tiny contrast edge for the GM. Mid-frame here, it's kind of the same story. Very, very, very similar, not a huge amount of difference. Down in the corner of the frame, I would say the same is true. I don't know that you would see much of a difference between these two results in the real world, and so I would call it a draw. Now, if we move on to 400 millimeters, arguably the most important part in the focal range, we find that the Sigma actually holds up really well and is arguably a little bit better in the center of the frame than what even the Canon is. At the mid-frame point, the Canon I think has a little bit of an edge, but they are very, very close. And here, if we look towards the outer edge of the frame, we see that the Canon is a little bit better at the periphery of the frame, but a really strong performance from Sigma. Now, if we compare to the GM lens, and obviously the framing was a little bit different at the time of taking these tests, but what you'll find is that once again, the Sigma competes really well in the center of the frame. If we take a look mid-frame, also the Sigma is looking quite good by its competition there, and so standing up strong. It's only down in the extreme corner where the Sony shows an advantage at 400 millimeters, and so the Sigma is arguably better in the center of the frame and even mid-frame. It's only at the edge where the GM is a little bit better. Stopping on down to f8 gives us a little bit of a contrast boost, but not a major difference here. So in real world performance, even at a 2-to-1 level here, you can see that we've got a lot of detail that is rendered here on this little robin. And in fact, if you look at it at just a pixel level, it looks really, really fantastic. I'm also impressed overall by the colors that I see, which are nicely saturated, nicely detailed, and deliver great looking images. The 0.24 times magnification isn't quite as good as either the Canon or the Sony GM. However, as you can see, we do have a nice detail and contrast that is rendered at minimum focus, so it does make it very useful. Here, case in point, that's a beautiful image, great color, a nice detail here on the tulip, and of course the background at 400 millimeters is just crushed, leaving you a really, really beautiful looking, unique result. The bokeh quality is good even at difficult distances, which I would consider this to be. So we've got good detail on our subject, great color, and the bokeh, even though it's, the distance doesn't allow this to be like a cream, it looks fairly good. You can see some deformation along the edges of the frame, however. And I thought here, again, kind of a challenging middle distance, that the bokeh quality actually looks quite good, and of course our subject looks great. When you get up close, you can really, really destroy backgrounds and blur them out beautifully, and it makes for a beautiful end result. You can see that here as well, just a result that I really, really like. So you can, of course, stop lenses like this down and use them for landscapes. Just note that, as you can see here, that even at f8, the depth of field is still not deep enough to include all of the scene, and so you do have to kind of bear that in mind. It's better when shooting a really distant subject where everything's going to be in detail, but as you can see, the detail, contrast, and color of the image looks great. One other thing to watch for over long distances like this, if you're going over long distances where there might be differing air pockets, you can see here that it's almost like a oil painting, and that's a byproduct of those layers of, out to about here you can see that it's okay, but beyond that it's a different kind of thermal pocket, and that really does play havoc in fine detail. So as far as the real-world OS performance, again, remember that OS really, it's not going to ever stop any movement of subjects. And so what we're looking at is if we have a still subject, if it is stabilizing. In this case, this is 400 millimeters and 1/40th of a second. And so that's 3 1/3 stop of assistance on this shot. But as you can see, it's done its job. There is no evidence of motion blur, even on a high resolution camera. Now in this case, we have got 1/10 of a second at 100 millimeters. And again, I wasn't necessarily trying for these images. This is where I find the value of OS is, in that these shots, I just wasn't paying enough attention in AV mode how low the shutter speed was getting in the lighting. And so byproduct though, is that as you can see, even at 1/10 of a second, no sign of motion blur, all the detail looks nice and crisp. And so that is the value of a good OS system. So finally, let's take a look at our flare resistance. And so you're not going to often point a lens like this into the sun, particularly on the long end. But here at 100 millimeters with the noonday sun in the middle of the frame, you can see just a little bit of veiling and a few little ghosting artifacts. If we move the sun's position up into the corner, you can see the longer kind of flare pattern there. Not too destructive, however. And then finally, if we stop it down, it doesn't really get a whole lot worse here, and so good results there. Moving on to 400 millimeters, you can see that there's a little bit more veiling. The ghosting pattern is really kind of broad at wide open, and then going to a stop down and putting it into the corner, you can see a little bit more of a ghosting pattern, but again, overall, it's not too bad. So as you can see, I consider that to be actually quite a strong performance, considering that there is some give and take over the zoom range between all of these lenses, and considering that the Sigma is priced so much cheaper than the alternatives, I think that that really is actually a recommendation under the circumstance. And so I would put it this way. I would say that when it comes to the build and to the autofocus system, you're getting somewhere between 85 and 90% of the performance. However, when it comes to the optical performance, you're very close to 98 to 100% of the overall optical performance, with one exception, and that is, I will point out, now the GM lens was not great in this regard either, but comparative to the Canon, for example, I find that the Sigma loses maximum aperture quite quickly. So it's f5, yes, but it's only f5 till about 112 millimeters, so about 12 millimeters, and then it becomes f5.6, and then somewhere around 236 millimeters it becomes f6.3. So that does mean that throughout some of the range you're going to have a disadvantage when it comes to maximum aperture. You know, at most 1/3 stop relative to the Sony. The gap's a little bit larger sometimes relative to the Canon, but you know, there's one criticism I have. But I believe actually the bokeh quality from the Sigma, to my eye, is more pleasing than what I saw from the G Master. So that's another perk in favor of this lens. So at the end of the day, this is a strong performance from Sigma. I think it's going to really fill a need that's existed on the Sony system of a lens with a focal length like this, but one that the masses can possibly afford. And the GM, of course, being out of reach for a lot of people just on a practical level with their budgets. And so kudos to Sigma for helping to plug the gaps, and I'm so glad to see this lens come to market. Now, if you want one, I understand that they will start to ship somewhere in early July, and so you might want to get a pre-order in if you are interested. I do have buying links in the description down below. However, this lens is just being announced on the day I'm releasing this review, so you may have to give it a day or two for some of those links to start to populate, and with some retailers it may take a little bit longer than that. But be patient, and as always, appreciate if you use the links below if you decide to purchase this and help to fund to keep this channel going. There's also linkage there to my full text review with a lot of comparison. You can take your time there, and I think it'll help your buying decision. Linkage also to an image gallery, and of course the standard links to follow me on social media, become a patron, sign up for my newsletter, and if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.